Hello, friends. Welcome to another Word of Gord. We're continuing on with our Average Folks in the Afterlife series. And we've been going at it hammer and tongs these last few days. And I hope you're enjoying it as much as I'm enjoying reading it. I find Jürgen's Hughes books absolutely fascinating. And dipping back into Bruce Moen's was an unexpected delight that we will continue on with. If not today, then very soon. So, Vistas of Infinity, Jürgen's Hughes. This chapter is called Non-Physical City Life. Some of you may have been wondering about astral plane cities. Well, there's plenty of them. And just as many as there is here, if not more. Towns, cities, villages, hamlets, they're all there. This was just one of those numerous experiences which took place on a slightly higher dimensional level, which follows the one that is almost a replica of our physical world. This is a level where people are firmly established and have adjusted their whole life and lifestyles to the increasing creative powers of these dimensions. The greatly increased power for creative manifestation has quite a dramatic effect on the dynamics of the lives of the people living here. The inhabitants are living at a higher pace, not driven by industry and the need to work as we do here in our cities, but simply because of the availability of increased powers of creativity and manifestation. In these regions, people feel motivated and at liberty to make almost all their dreams and wishes come true. When I first realized that I was on another dimension beyond my physical body, I was confronted with life in a large city that simply could not have any equivalent on Earth. It was the sheer flamboyant design of the buildings and the generous layout of the streets that demonstrated this. I was amazed by the number of people milling through the busy streets and wondered why this city was so populous. On further inspection, I saw no reason why there shouldn't be busy cities, although there appeared to be no need for an economic infrastructure. People enjoy city life on Earth for cultural, entertainment, and social needs, and there is no reason why people should choose to live anywhere else after advancing into new dimensions. In the obvious absence of economic requirements, the space was filled with incredible creativity and the production of all sorts of artistic artifacts, which was expressed in the extraordinary design of the houses and their incredible detail, the numerous malls and stalls along the streets. People were driving along in inventive forms of transport and quite odd-looking, to the point of humorous flying machines. The atmosphere was busy and yet cheerful, frequently interspersed with an almost childish sense for play. There were street parties and a number of festivities, and everywhere I looked there were things going on, such as street theatre or reenactments on a grand scale. I could easily have spent days, perhaps weeks or even months, studying the hectic life and interacting with its people. My attention was drawn towards an attractive young woman. She wore a dress with a flowered pattern. She smiled openly at me and obviously noted that I was only a visitor coming from a different place altogether and still attached to a human biological body, unlike all the other people here. I am frequently surprised at being identified as such and still not have worked out or inquired how. She came towards me by floating across a few stalls filled with hundreds of beautifully crafted objects. "Do you like it here?" She smiled at me, waiting for a reaction. I also couldn't help noticing her deep-cut dress and her beautiful breasts being attractively displayed. I felt embarrassed when I looked at them, but she simply laughed out loud as if she was testing me. "You're very pretty," I heard myself say in my justification for staring at her incredible incredibly shaped body. She came closer to me and I felt a surge of sexual attraction, which I found difficult to disguise. She burst out laughing and took my hand. You don't have to be ashamed about what you feel. We see things quite differently here. I became aware of an easy intimacy here in stark contrast to our physical ways of social interaction. People seem to be less inhibited in showing their feelings, probably because feelings here are much harder to disguise. On Earth we can simply pretend and pull the wool over each other's eyes. Here people have to own up to their thoughts and emotions. Consequently, they make allowances and are much more open. The girl then pulled me along the large hall, which was like an over-displayed museum, and pointed at all the beautiful objects we passed by. I couldn't decide which held the greater fascination, her beautiful, open and charming disposition, or the incredible display of figurines and crafted objects of all kinds that we passed. They were fashioned artistically from the most unusual stones, crystals and ebony, and were not just very lifelike, but almost alive. Then, to my utter alarm, I saw the man at the end stall, lift up a table and toss the whole display into the air, where it crashed down to the ground, shattering the precious display in a million pieces. He burst out laughing when he saw my expression of horror. Then, with a grandiose theatrical gesture, he commanded all the pieces to reassemble like in a gigantic magic trick. I found this whole display rather disconcerting and not at all funny. This only seemed to make him enjoy himself even more as he turned to his friend, who was also creased up with laughter. A telling incident there. By this time I felt rather overwhelmed with all the activity and craved some quietness. I went outside the hall and noticed that I had lost my female companion. She was nowhere to be seen. The street was crowded and the city appeared vast, and I had no way of knowing how to get out of it. It was not an unfriendly place, not at all like the inner city of London, which had none of this cheerful, carefree atmosphere. Not at all like the inner city of London, which had none of this cheerful, carefree atmosphere. It was just too hectic and too busy for me. I considered focusing on the pretty lady to find out whether she was acting as my guide. Instead, I felt a gentle knocking in my head, something I often noticed when returning to physical awareness, and became simultaneously aware that I was lying in bed, yet still immersed in the pictures of the city. Julia gently woke me and offered me a cup of tea. I smiled at her cheerfully, wondering whether female intuition had been at work to stop my potential infidelity in its tracks. She smiled back at me as if she knew. Later I asked, but she denied having had any extrasensory knowledge. Next section. Everything we imagine is pulled from an existing reality. 2013. Sometimes I come across scenarios I simply have not been prepared for, as there is no equivalent on the physical planet. There can't be, because our physical laws of nature won't allow it. Some things are literally beyond this world, and I am always open, even eager to discover and explore new scenarios. Something never seen before, something totally out of this world. Last night I made such a visit, unfortunately cut short when I was gently awoken by the clinking noise of a teaspoon in a freshly brewed mug of tea. It started off as a lucid dream, which only became lucid when I was told that I was the new owner of a two-wheeled Volkswagen Beetle. The strangeness of the Beetle, with only the front half of the 50s VW and the rest like an open chariot, catapulted me into full OBE awareness and into a world that was totally out of this world. This was not the result of an early morning meditation, but no doubt triggered by heavy REM sleep. Often when finding myself lucid, I used this state to meditate in order to enter deeper levels of consciousness, but this was too weird and too good to be missed. After parking my two-wheeled VW chariot outside a huge leisure complex, I became instantly drawn into the outlandish leisure activities of people who could only be described as a bunch of the most extrovert holidaymakers I had ever come across. The first thing I noticed was when I was hit by a table tennis-sized ball in the face. I spotted a man 100 yards away telling me, via my second ball in the face, that I should get out of the way as I was in the flight path of their strange game, where the player threw several balls simultaneously, destined to hit other balls to be displaced towards various destinations on the playing field. Jumping to safety, I looked around and saw the most amazing architectural complex imaginable surrounding me. The best way I can describe it is as a series of elaborate chrome domes, futuristic looking but clearly inspired by 1950s automotive design. Hugely extravagant and testosterone driven, distinctly male. This was an astral vocational playground, frequented by attractive people and couples hell-bent on having fun. It was a style-conscious Las Vegas, but without the limitations. With my jaw dropping in amazement at this bewildering anarchy of designs, I tried to construct a plan of how to best gather all the data of such ludicrous abundance of information in order to fashion a comprehensive picture of this strange world I had been plunged into. In the end, I was left with impressions I knew would take years to put in some form of context, so I just drifted through the crowds, hoping that my non-physical brain would have the secret power to store what I was witnessing for later retrieval. I still have a clear impression in my mind of some of the architecture I have seen, and as an illustrator it would not be too hard to reproduce it for documentation. What is so much harder to document is the general atmosphere and some of the extraordinary detail, the gravity-defying constructions. If I were to illustrate some of these scenes, people no doubt might simply accuse me of making it up on the grounds that I have illustrated science fiction book covers in my past. Having said that, I often wonder where some of my colleagues get their inspiration from. I could easily pick on illustrations and sceneries from modern films and categorically state that the images were simply inspired by actual non-physical realities, indirectly or unconsciously copied from astral environments. As an artist, I know where our minds can take us when we let go of physical focus. I have seen my colleagues unknowingly dipping into the storehouse of the great unconscious. We are all equally resourcing as well as creating. Take our physical body out of the equation, and what we are left with are the creations, as real and as solid as our focus of attention will allow. Everything is real and as hard as here in the physical reality, though not everything is relevant to our focus of awareness or the life we live at the moment. This is true. As far as I'm concerned, creative people drift into the astral and mental planes and get visual, verbal, philosophical, architectural inspiration, which they then reproduce or try to reproduce in this earth, on this earth, with the materials available to them and the budgets. Another section called The Art of Manifestation. October 2012. On this occasion, after weeks of not showing the slightest interest in OBEs and completely out of the blue, I spontaneously became aware in my dream. When this happens, I pay attention because invariably consciousness is showing me something deemed important. Inevitably, new parts of our unfathomable jigsaw will be revealed in this way. I focused immediately on my hands. The surroundings were very dark and not very clear at all, so I called out for clarity now, which I don't use very often. Immediately my surrounding came into focus. I proceeded to intensify my awareness by focusing on my hands until full waking consciousness was established. I was inside a village on a village green. 50 yards away was an open gate to an estate. A dog came bounding up to me as if I was its owner, very friendly, and I stroked him. He then jumped ahead of me, and I followed him through the half-open wrought-iron gate. The dog stopped by a man and who was his real owner, who patted his head and then welcomed me. We shook hands as he pointed out that he could see I was not a resident. I was then invited to say hello to his friends. We walked toward a country house, which was much smaller than the big gate we had walked through would have led me to believe. After entering the front door, I followed him upstairs into a lounge. There were 3 women. One was sitting on a sofa and 2 were in armchairs around a small table. They were very friendly and soon engaged me in conversation. "It's not too often that we meet conscious travellers," one woman with curly blonde hair said as she offered me a seat. The room was tastefully furnished, and at the far end sat another woman who was preoccupied with something else. After casting a glance at me, she simply ignored me and carried on with what she was doing. The lady on the sofa pointed at my trousers and said they were an unusual design and that she hadn't come across any like mine before. As I looked down, I noticed I was wearing the beige trousers I had bought in the summer in a men's fashion shop. It was only when I came home that I noticed they had strange cross-stitchings above and below the knees and had a low waistline. I'm not a fashion-conscious person, and my purchase had been purely accidental. My wife Julia had tactfully pointed out that men like myself at a pensionable age would normally avoid purchasing such a garment designed for 16-year-olds. I then remembered from an earlier experience that on the next level, people are not always familiar with design and fashions on Earth. The most vivid example was during an earlier experience where I was observing cars. Some of them were distinctly old-fashioned but aiming to be modern, and yet missing current car designs by miles. The most ridiculous car was one that aspired to be a modern Mercedes. Sadly, the only thing it had in common with this aspirational brand was the 3-pointed star. The owner of the car seemed to be totally oblivious that a company like Mercedes would never dream of designing a clunky object like that. I also noticed there was no link at all to current earthly design trends, and I had the feeling that the people in this town had simply lost contact with the quote-unquote real world altogether, and had evolved their own culture by muddling along on their old and often outmoded memories. This was an amazing thing which I observed over and over again, the distinct idiosyncrasies in astral cultures of closed-off communities. We find this on Earth as well, of course, such as the Amish community or some native tribes still hidden in remote forests. On the non-physical realities, this was just much more pronounced and common, as there was a quite natural cultural attraction of conforming tastes. So you can find distinct communities on the astral level that form a kind of coherent style. Here in the sitting room I had been invited to, I noticed that the woman who had complimented me on my choice of stylish trousers had reproduced them simply by an act of intent, and she was now holding a pair in her hands and brushing lightly over the stitching. I asked her whether she was fond of our current fashion on planet Earth, which she confirmed. She then proceeded to manifest a matching jacket to my trousers, which I did not wear, but she told me that this would go well together. I noticed the jacket had subtle lines like inverted cord in the same colour as the trousers. I noticed the ease with which she manifested these items and asked her how she did that. "It is very easy once you get the hang of it," she told me. "You just have to use your imagination and simply trust it." "Show me," she said. "Have a cup of tea," she offered, and without any effort whatsoever, she handed me a cup filled with tea ready to drink. I took a sip and then put it down. "I want to try," I said. I visualized a teacup, and in my hand a porcelain object formed. It was like a cup, but distorted. There was a gap in the side which would prevent it holding any liquid. The woman laughed. She told me that I had to put a bit more effort into it. Not knowing how, I used my other hand to try and fix the gap with my fingers, as you would with a freshly thrown clay pot that was split. This cup was already solid and even glazed, displaying a distinct pattern, which I had no idea of where it had come from. I certainly did not imagine it and figured I must have added it subconsciously. Finally, I fixed the gap, but the cup was still distorted, showing the marks I had left with my fumbling fingers. Giving up on the idea of ever being able to produce a perfect result, I focused on filling it with tea. This seemed to be a lot easier. I imagined that this was because I already knew what tea was and simply expected tea to be there, and it was. As I hadn't managed to create a handle, I picked up my grotesque creation and proceeded to drink. To my astonishment, the tea was little more than water, and my face must have shown it. My audience laughed out loud and one said, "Try it now." My second sip showed me that the liquid in my cup had magically turned into proper tea. We then started a long conversation. I commented about how real everything was and how physical it all felt, and that it must have been very strange for them to get used to their lives after they had first arrived. There are many things more strange than this here, although being able to conjure up things out of thin air took some getting used to, the blonde woman said. We talked some more. Did she feel this life was more real than her physical one she had left behind? She told me her past life hardly featured anymore and meant little. It was a distant memory at most and more like a dream. This was much more intense and interesting, although also more disturbing if you didn't adapt and keep control of your thoughts and feelings, she added. Her friends elaborated and told me that appearances were less consistent than on Earth. I recalled when Googling school friends I had known as a child and tracing their adult pictures after 40 years, there would have been no way I would have recognized some of them. Here it was much more intense. I found that out when the individual who had introduced me to his female companions suggested I should follow him and have a bath. I was puzzled and wondered whether I looked dirty or, worse still, smelled funny. He laughed and told me that I would enjoy it because it was not like a bath I had ever had before. He led me out of the room, down the stairs, into an open courtyard, and there in the middle was a bathtub filling with water. Just then a man walked past me with a towel round his waist. He was fat, with prominent blue veins stretching hideously all over his white skin. I was so shocked that I gasped. The man, aware of my reaction, turned round. As he did so, his appearance began to change. His body size and skin colour returned to a more normal state, and the blue veins disappeared. Instantly I was aware that his body was simply expressing his state of mind, and my awareness must have jolted his thoughts, returning him to normal. This was not the first time I had noticed that what goes on inside people very often finds expression on their outside. Seeing this so graphically and blatantly in operation, I wondered why none of the afterlife explorers and mediums had drawn much attention to this fluid state. I had observed it on many other occasions. This dynamic change of our outer appearance in sync to our emotions, thoughts, and feelings, which, unless we assert discipline or know how to stop this responsiveness, will naturally take place. I don't recall seeing much of that myself, so I'll put my hand and say guilty, Jurgen. If I have seen it, I'd forgotten about it, and that I don't think it's in any of my books. Certainly there's a direct perception of people when you're working with them in a retrieval situation. If they say something to you and they're maybe hiding something that they're ashamed of, you can feel that, you can intuit that. I wouldn't say that I could see it, but I can feel it. And something they're ashamed of, something they're fearful of, that sort of a thing. You'll see bits of their past that you need to see in order to do the retrieval, the rescue efficiently. But I usually sense that intuitively. I don't see things. Anyway, I returned to the bath and stripped off. The water did not feel wet, but had a strange, invigorating quality. I became excited just swirling the water in the bath with my arms. My mind became very lucid, and I marveled at the crispness and vividness of my experience, and the fact that I must have spent the best part of an hour with little pull from my body. That changed abruptly when I heard a noise coming from my bedroom, physical noise of the shower door from the ensuite, which terminated my experience. Some thoughts of Jürgen's on manifesting. Previously, I had established that there are 5 basic natural powers which enable us to conjure up objects out of thin air, where intent is probably the most unnatural or complicated one, mainly because the focus is on the mind, which can be disconnected from the driving energy of emotion, as in my case with a cup of tea. It is far easier to expect something without even thinking about it, but even this may not result in the quality of manifestation we've expected. Quality relies on clarity and purity of the channel created. A selfish person will find quality manifestation much harder. The power of expectation is the second way of manifestation, and a very common one. And closely linked to this is the power of habit, where we open the manifestation channel simply by repeated use of the same process. This is why we find people, quote unquote, employing other people to do the manifestation for them, like looking for a tradesman to fix our house or a painter to do a painting for us. Though with a bit of practice we can do all this ourselves. The payoff for getting people to do our bidding is that the benefit they receive that comes with service, mainly a brightening in their circumstances. Another power is the power of consensus, where a group of people work on a project together. And lastly is the power of desire, where intense desire becomes the driving force behind our manifestation process. However, this involves a mixture of attitudes of wanting and letting go, which initiates and stimulates subconscious energies to complete the process. Metamorphosis. I got up early in the morning in order to meditate, but instead I spent most of my time thinking about other things. I opened my eyes, focused on my breath for a 10-minute break. Finally, I managed to meditate as usual for about another hour. I then became aware of a strong hypnagogic image of a road with dark grey gravel. When my consciousness turned dreamy, I entered into the scene. The first thing to do was to establish full waking consciousness. This was extraordinarily clear. I picked up some gravel from the ground and watched it closely as it ran through my fingers, making a musical tinkling sound. I noticed that a lot on the astral plane. Things that make musical tinkling sounds. Wind in the trees, grass seems to tinkle sometimes, babbling brooks, a lot of tinkling things, delicate sort of textural tinkling. It's quite marvelous. I sailed up high on the wings of euphoria, leaving hills and mountains streaming past underneath me. The landscape below me was simply breathtaking. I noticed to my left a hillside community with cute dwellings nestling against the mounds. Moving closer, I saw that they were artists' open-air studios. The first artist I saw as I hovered about 10 feet above her was a woman producing a pencil drawing of a life model. To my surprise, I noticed that the artist herself was covered in pencil marks, almost as if somebody had drawn her. A little further along, I spotted a large building also built into the hillside, with a number of studios jutting out like balconies into the open. I landed in a courtyard and proceeded to visit a large studio. To my utter astonishment, I found that the artist looked rather surreal. One in particular stood out as if he was a cubist representation of his painting. Nearly all the artists in the studio somewhat resembled their own paintings. One man's representation shocked me initially until I looked at the grotesqueness of his drawing, in which he had represented himself with snakes in place of his limbs, his drawing on paper closely resembling his actual disfigured body. Had I not been in full waking consciousness during this whole episode, I could have easily believed that this was just a very weird and surreal dream. But it was not. I then realized that the intense concentration of these artists had them identified so much with their work that they had transformed themselves into 3D versions of their drawings. When I spoke to one of them with her concentration broken, she morphed slowly back into herself with a smile. This episode made me aware of how intensely psychological this world actually is. Looking back, in the past I did not always enter such strange events into my journals, simply because I had felt that I could have fallen victim to an elaborate dream, and that I had not been observing an objective consensus reality after all. After many more experiences, I am now certain and convinced that my observations are authentic and true, even if I have come across few experiencers having reported these phenomena. There is much we don't know yet, don't want to know, or can't accept about our afterlife state, because it is simply too strange and doesn't fit into our preconceived ideas of what reality should be like. Or we simply like to believe that after all our struggles here in this world, death should finally give us our much needed break and eternal peace. Well, some more provocative and entertaining narratives there from Jürgen. And what was I going to add? Yes, the marvelous feeling of the water in the bath. I had years ago many lucid dream recalls of swimming in an astral plane river where the water was incredibly invigorating, and when you come out after swimming it immediately dries off of you. And it had a sort of it may not sound pleasant, but a sort of pleasant oily texture. And you'd think, well, why would water being oily be pleasant? But it was. And again, it wouldn't leave a residue. But yeah, marvelous swimming on astral rivers. Very invigorating. So, didn't get to Bruce Moen this time, but we will next time. Astral plane libraries and all sorts of interesting stuff. So until then, dear friends, may you be well, may you be at peace in this turmoil world of ours, and so long.